Hello, everyone. My name is Rio. I will be walking you through the reading and writing portion of our SAT Hamilton Test 306. I run the humanities program here at Hamilton. You may know me from teaching or tutoring or any other thing. We'll go through every answer for the reading and writing tests, both the first and the second module, and you can skip around the video to look at just the questions you want to look at. With that, we'll get going. We'll begin. So question one here, a word in context question. We have a fill in the gap portion. That means we're looking for a definition or a synonym somewhere in this text. So where we see a definition for the word that's being used is right here. That doesn't focus only on curing illnesses, but also alleviating pain and improving the quality of remaining life for patients and their families. All right. All of these answer choices have something to do with care, right? Preventative care is something you've heard of. Diagnostic care is something you've heard of. Curative makes sense, right? But palliative, that is the one that's correct. Why? Because the definition of palliative is alleviating pain and improving quality of life prior to death, ultimately, right? That's exactly the definition of that word. All right, so if you're missing a question like this is a sign that you should be studying our vocab words, right? We have several thousand vocab words for you to study, but this is one of the first 100 that you might read. It'll be hard to choose palliative without knowing what that word means. However, even if you don't know what palliative means, I think we can get rid of preventative, right? Because we're not preventing anything diagnostic. We're not diagnosing anything, curing. Clearly, we're not just curing something here, right? Even though all of these have something to do with care. So you can probably get rid of those three and arrive at palliative, even if you don't know what it means. But knowing what the word means would make it much, much easier. All right, so for question two, if you miss this question, it is likely that you don't know what the correct word means. And you maybe chose a word like superior, which is kind of functions, but doesn't have the great precise definition like our correct answer, tenacious, does. Right? So tenacious means to hold on to something or to do something in spite of adversity or, in spite of other things leading you the other way, right? So for fast fashion to have a tenacious grip on consumers would mean that it has a strong hold despite other things that would seem to break that hold. So what would be breaking that hold? Well, all this despite stuff, right? Despite detrimental impact on the environment and human rights, nonetheless, fast fashion still has a hold on consumers, right? Fleeting is an opposite distractor, right? Fleeting would work if all of this led it to say that fast fashion was experiencing a decline, but it isn't. Deficient, same sort of thing. And then superior to what, right? Superior is a comparative, so that doesn't really work here either. Tenacious is a perfect word if we are knowing exactly what is the precise definition of it for this context. So study vocab if you're missing this. All right, so for question three here on module one, typically on a word and context question, we're looking for a definition, a synonym, something of that sort. Here, we are learning by the contrast, right? In contrast to this here means that whatever is here, we will want the opposite of for our fill in the blank. So Winslow Homer paints the natural world with severity and raw power, stormy seas on a rugged coastline. Okay? So we want the opposite of those things. So turbulent, which means kind of like chaotic, like chaotic and turbulent are synonyms here. Both of those would define this, but we're looking for the opposite of this here, right? So that means we can get rid of turbulent and chaotic. Now, dramatic can surely be a scene, and dramatic doesn't exactly mean this, but placid has the perfect definition to fit with up here, right? place of inspiration through respite. When something is placid, it is at rest. Okay. Lake Placid has no wind on it. When you're feeling placid, you are at rest, you are calm, at ease. Okay. So turbulent and chaotic are opposite distractors, and dramatic just does not fit nearly as good as placid does in this context. If you're missing a question like this, guess what? Placid is on our vocab list, right? It's also a word that apparently has been on the SAT. So this is a good word for you to know, and the vocab lists are a good thing for you to study. All right, so for question 4, I always want to, so this is a word in context question. I always want to point us to this logical and precise word or phrase definition, right? We want something which is very precise for our thing here. So how do they consider this tradition? Okay, this tradition that leads to the word patriarchy. So what is the tradition? The tradition is paterfamilias and patria potestas, both of which give a incredible power to the father, and that these things were deemed inviolable, right? And so basically, like these inviolable, like you cannot violate these things, right? And if you were to violate them, they got severe punishments, such as execution. So doing something against your father, right? Or against the like ability of your father to determine your whole life in Rome was something that could be met with execution. All right, so this is certainly not trivial, right? Now, though this action may be barbaric, and though we see a barbaric past linked to the Romans, who were, probably the most barbaric of all people, we cannot connect that to here because we would be saying that the Romans considered it barbaric, but instead, the Romans considered it very important. All right, now we're between sacrosanct and venerated. So for one, this is a good thing that the SAT loves to do. They like to see if you know how things are used in common use, right? We don't say things are considered, that was considered venerated. You would just say a tradition that was venerated, right? This considered is something that kind of is weird there. Now, something that is sacrosanct is something that is like unable to be interfered with, right? It is something that is like seen at the ultimate pinnacle, something that you cannot touch, right? This law is something that could not be touched. Okay. So other offenses might be forgivable. Other offenses might be something that we can handle, right? But violating this one is a no-go. You get executed, right? This is a tradition that was ultimately one of the most important defining traditions of Roman culture, according to this passage. And therefore, it's sacrosanct. It's something that cannot be messed with, okay? So though it might be venerated, sacrosanct is both more precise and it is more logical. It's more precise because it fits the definition clearer than venerated does. And it's more logical because you would never say something is considered venerated, but you would say something is considered sacrosanct. Now, if you're missing this, you likely need to study your vocab. So question 5, I'm sure a lot of people are kind of frustrated with, but I think this is one of the most important questions we'll see on this test in terms of the vocab. All right. A is certainly the best answer choice here, which is what the SAT asks. They ask for the most logical and precise word or phrase to answer these up here. They don't ask for something that fits, right? But they ask for something that is most logical and precise. So what does guile mean? It's likely that you don't know what it means if you're missing this question. Guile is basically an incredible skill at deceiving and misleading others, right? It's intelligent, right? People who have guile are typically, guile is seen as kind of like an intelligence at manipulating or lying, okay? So that is exactly what this is. Though creativity, artistry, and precision all come into play here, according to this passage, right? Guile incorporates all of those things, right? But to the purpose of what is going on, right? They exhibit guile in doing what they do. So I would point to a few things, right? Is there much of a difference between creativity and artistry, right? Those two things, mean particularly practically the same thing. We see both of those in here. But guile is an overarching umbrella that includes those two things in this instance, but with the particular connotation of what's going on here, which is deception, a type of thievery, right? They certainly require precision to work here, but in order to have, but that precision is going towards misleading, right? That precision is for the purpose of lying and deceiving people, which is, again, an aspect or an attribute of guile. There's no such thing as like worrying about it being repetitive, right, or redundant. That is what the SAT loves to do. They love to give you synonyms right up here to fit the word that you're actually looking for, right? We see deceive, okay? So all these things lead to their ability to deceive, which is ultimately connoted by the word guile, better than creativity, artistry, or precision do, right? If we maybe saw some kind of like words like, however, we may not consider the precision that goes into this, or we might not consider the artistry or creativity, these sort of things going into this, maybe that would work. But the negative connotation of guile is perfectly fitting for this passage. So that is why it's correct. And the others, though they can work, are not the most logical, nor are they the most precise word for this question. So no need to be upset. Study the vocab. You probably just didn't know what guile meant. All right, so question 6, if you're missing this one, it is likely you might just not know what two of these words mean. I think we all can probably make sense of what descriptive and neutral mean. But what is pejorative and what is laudatory? So something that is laudatory is praising something, right? He is lauded for being a deep thinking director, right? Meaning people respect and praise him for that. Pejorative is a word that has kind of a negative connotation, right? So we use pejorative to refer to words that create a negative connotation, right? Think of the difference between saying somebody is frugal versus saying somebody is cheap, right? If someone's frugal, it means they're saving money, in a kind of nice way, right? A thoughtful way. Whereas if you're cheap, that's a pejorative term, right? Where you're going, like, you've got money, but you just won't spend it on others, right? That's you're being like a Scrooge or a miser. Okay, so how can we tell that pejorative is the correct word here? Right, so here we say, while some musicians, and certainly the current generation, have come to embrace the term. So this while is really important. While some embrace it, the critics who invented the term used it in a certain sense, implying that the musicians were more concerned with their effects pedals than engaging with their audience. Okay, now this active embrace with the while in front of it needs to contrast with something, right? So we need to see the opposite of what we would expect. Okay, if things are being embraced, we would expect it to be positive, right? But we're looking for rather the opposite of positive, which would be pejorative. Okay. It is descriptive, right? But why would there be this while here for something that's descriptive? Okay, there wouldn't be that contrast there. So that is not the most precise word. It's definitely not laudatory. And finally, nor is it neutral, right? Because to embrace something unexpectedly requires for that thing on the other side to be the opposite of what you would expect, which would be the opposite of positive. Okay, so logic at play here, and probably the need to study more vocab. And that wraps us up with our first set of words and context for our first module here. So question 7 here, when we're asked about the function of an underlined sentence, it means we need to read the whole thing, okay? So I'm working through this. I'm presuming that you've read the whole thing. If you didn't, pause and read the whole thing now, okay? I'm not going to read it for you now on screen. I'm going to focus just on this underlined sentence, really, okay? But first I want to show a few things that might have led you astray. Here we have an intangible and spiritual resource. And here we see a spiritual and intangible value of the wilderness. Okay. This you might think, ooh, this language is the same as this language. That's good, right? However, does it criticize those who do not understand that in this sentence or in this passage whatsoever? No, right? That is what we call a recycled language distractor. All right. D, does the author think that wilderness preservation shouldn't solely be from perceived recreational value? Yeah, he thinks we should consider some more, right? This is saying, I don't want to just consider these wilderness values, which includes recreation. I want to think about more than that. However, does he say we should take no basis at all? No, he doesn't say that either. That's a too extreme distractor, right? Now, finally, A. Okay, A is a really hard one to get rid of because he does want us to emphasize, in doing this, he is emphasizing the importance of including all different uses or values of the wilderness in the report. But is he focusing on potential recreational values here? No. What is he focusing on? He's focusing on the value of wilderness as an idea, right? He wants the wilderness idea as a resource that matters in itself, right? So that says it right here. It has intrinsic value beyond its practical resources. When we insinuate something, it means we suggest something without stating it super plainly, even though he does state it pretty plainly. Okay, so that's how we arrive to B. Remember, I prefer us being deductive in how we work through a question rather than inductive, right? So getting rid of answer choices is always a good strategy. All right, so for question 8 here, I want to show us what some of our distractors are. I'm presuming that you have read this text already, okay? So this is a prose poem from a Romanian poet. It talks about how poets are everywhere and they look a certain ways and they do certain things, okay? So according to the text, meaning a detail question here, what is true of writers in the region referenced, okay? So what is true of writings according to the text? So I'm going to show you a few distractors here. Uniquely unconventional, opting for aesthetic choices that would not be typical of writers elsewhere. Okay, this is a half-right distractor, okay, meaning half of it is correct, but not all of it. And also recycled language. So yes, they do say that there are some, right, that are unconventional looking, right? But do they say that they would not be typical of writers elsewhere? No. Okay, that part is the important caveat that makes that wrong. D, they are profound, finding poignant beauty in otherwise desperate circumstances, such as funerals or deforestation. Okay, that's a little bit of a sophisticated distractor. We sometimes call that finding Nemo, meaning you're going too far, right? It says that writers appear when a tree is planted or chopped down, right? They say that writers appear in all situations, right? When a grave is dug. Okay. However, are we talking about how they find a poignant beauty in here? No, it just says that they show up, right? So that is going too far. Finally, A is a little bit too extreme, right? Exploitative, lucrative adventures, right? So yes, they do see moments as opportunities from which to write about, right? When they see an empty space, you come up with something, right? When I walk down, all of these different circumstances are ones which kind of would lead you to write. However, are we pursuing lucrative ventures, right? Is this all about making money? Do they mention making money here at all? No. Finally, exploitative, meaning to take advantage of others, right? Not just utilization, but taken advantage of? No. So remember, be deductive here, okay? Get rid of answer choices that have something wrong with them, and that's how we arrived at what's correct. So finally with B, so ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere. as a consequence of many circumstances, both mundane and exceptional, right? So we see some exceptional things, right? Like, these are kind of exceptional. And then we see some mundane things, right? Grass is mown crossing the street, everywhere, right? They're also everywhere. So everything about B seems pretty sensible, right? Everything. And then this clarifies that ultimately they're going to get to work, right? All these things lead to them producing work. So that's how we arrive to B, mainly by getting rid of A, C, and D. All right, question 9 is an example of something I find on the SAT fairly commonly, which is that graphic questions, these command of evidence, quantitative questions, are a lot of times more straightforward than we might expect. Okay, so we want to support the conclusions by these people. And so what are their conclusions, right? Their conclusion is that there is accelerated glacial retreat, right? So basically, glaciers are going faster than they would, and that these are seen, universally across all these glaciers, right? Now, I'm going to point out some distractor types here. Okay, B. B, this is kind of in the text, right? But is that their conclusion? No, this is just something else that comes from outside their conclusion. Secondly, I would say that this is a Finding Nemo distractor. Okay, meaning you're swimming too far. You're going too far to make sense of this. It's like sophisticated sounding, so you're going for it, right? Now here we see an acceleration in length. Okay, are they accelerating in length? No, right? They're going down in length. So maybe if there's an acceleration in retreat, we would be okay here, right? So, however, it's not true, right? They're not all accelerating faster, or they're not all going bigger. They're all getting smaller, opposite. Now let's look at D. Okay. So D is a little bit too extreme, right? It's like just not totally true of the graph. Okay. So they all see an acceleration of glacial retreat. So that's good, right? But are they all at their highest rate of retreat at the end of the study period? I would say that that's not the case, right? It looks like this is a more steep than this, right? And you might say that this here looks more steep than this. I don't think you can universalize this here. So that is too extreme, okay? So that leads us to a really, really straightforward answer choice. All the glaciers have exhibited significant decreases in length over the time period. Yeah, every single one has gone down over the time period, right? The line of best fit goes down for every single one of these graphs. So that's what we need. Perfect, right? Sometimes these are really straightforward. Look for what's wrong in answer choices and get rid of them. That's how you arrive at the correct answer. All right, so question 10 here is a bit of a doozy. I kind of understand if you're frustrated by missing this question, if you're selecting one particular answer choice here, but I will point us back to something here, right? Most directly support their conclusions. Okay, so we got to make a connection between what they say and what they're trying to support. So what are their conclusions? Well, their conclusion is that the MIT team's conclusion is that wave-induced erosion is present, right? Similar to the processes observed in Earth. So we want to see a discovery that supports the idea of wave-induced erosion, right? So what would support wave-induced erosion? Well, that there is a radar image that shows wave-induced erosion, including rounded sea coastlines and rough shorelines on narrow lakes, right? Which are things that are associated with wave action, right? Now, as for our other answer choices, all right, what's wrong with them? This doesn't support the claim of wave-induced erosion. This supports methane rainstorms. And this is an opposite distractor, right? This is showing the opposite of wave-induced erosion. Now, finally, A says that there would be wave action erosion, whether detectable via imaging or not. Why? Okay, because there is consistent dissolution. Does dissolution, but here it says dissolution and wave-induced erosion are opposites, right? So erosion would be produced by dissolution, according to some, but the MIT scientists believe that erosion is produced by waves, okay? This is not a very strong or direct support of their conclusions because it is saying that both dissolution and wave action erosion are present or detectable, possibly, right? Whereas C strongly supports this or directly supports it because it says that there's wave action erosion because of particular parameters that are only associated with wave action erosion, as opposed to dissolution, which is the alternate explanation, right? So that is what leads us to C and what allows us to eliminate A, which I think is a really hard and challenging one. And this, if true, is kind of tricky here. Okay, so, but I would say this, even if this is true, is this strong support for their claim? No, right? Even if that is true, even if consistent dissolution would suggest wave action erosion, is that a strong support? Not necessarily, right? What is strong support? Seeing exactly what we talk about in the passage by the MIT team, like we see in answer choice C. Okay, so question 11 is another really straightforward command of evidence quantitative question. All right, so we want to support the researchers' findings. So what is their findings, right? Their findings is that supercommuters, the number of them have significantly increased over the past decade, right? Now they say that this is driven by, factors including high housing costs in urban areas as opposed to less developed suburbs, increased job opportunities, etc. But the most important thing that they found is this, right? That supercommuters, have significantly increased over the past decade. So these supercommuters have gone up. What shows that? Okay, well, this is a percent increase in supercommuters over the period 2020 or the period 2010 to 2020, right? So all of these are going up, right? There are no below zero, okay? So this is a naturally comparative graph. Even if we don't see more than one bar, this is all comparing to a baseline of the year before 2010. So they all have seen increases, right? So C, we have a baggage distractor, right? That supports their claim, but is there any way to know that, that's true? And even if it was the case, I mean, even if you could know, I would say that this sort of cancels it out, right? This is also a baggage distractor. Okay, so these are all baggage distractors here, right? You can only go based off of the graph and based off of the text, which leads us to D. All right, so for question 12, we're looking for two things coming from our question. We're looking to, one, support the researcher's conclusion and understand the theory of how eukaryotic cells evolved, right? So we need to understand how, and we need to find an answer choice that supports the claim that it is upholds or proves the theory of eukaryotic cell development. So where do we learn this in eukaryotic cells? Right here, we have it right here. Endosymbiosis is explained in which one prokaryotic cell is subsumed by another prokaryotic cell and becomes used for the eating cell's purposes, right? So that's the theory. How does what they found prove the theory, right? Well, they had a cyanobacterium absorbed by an algae, which now functions as an internal organ, right? Here we have this. It is significant as it mirrors the ancient evolutionary steps that led to the development of organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts. Okay, so how would we show that it becomes subsumed and completely integrated into the DNA and life cycle of the larger cell? Well, C says that, right? This is the subsumed cell within the larger cell, and it has lost its own DNA and relies on the host for survival and acquiring its genetic code, right? So C directly connects to the claim made there in the passage, right? So that's why C is correct. Let's make sense of why these other ones are wrong, okay? Symbiotic relationships is sort of a baggage distractor here. We're not actually talking about symbiotic relationships really, even though we do have the symbiosis term here, right? But what would prove this earlier theory is here, right? Not about symbiosis, right? If it's just used symbiotically, it might not prove that this led to organelles and eukaryotic cell development. B is actually an opposite distractor, right? So them not becoming permanent parts of the internal structure actually goes against this claim here, right? So that's why we can get rid of B. And then finally, D, if this is still able to survive independently, it is not completely integrated, right? That means it's just existing, okay? So C is the only one which supports the claim here, just the actual claim we're focused on, even if this is the claim that we might think we're looking at, okay? So that's how we arrive to C for this tricky little science passage on the SAT. So question 13 here, I mean, one, it's kind of fun, right? There's this dude, ate a cricket on CNN, okay, because he was misunderstanding polls. But let me just point to where we're looking at, okay? So one key issue was this here, right? So surveys that called more Republicans or accounted for education levels did somewhat better. Demographic weighting factors such as race and age were also discussed, right? Though they might not fully resolve the discrepancies, okay? So I just want to point out, right, fully resolving the discrepancies isn't required in order to make something better, okay? I want to point out a few types of distractors we have here, right? So completely abandon, okay? That's a too extreme distractor right there. Okay, that's going too far. So intentional misreporting due to the partisan preferences of those conducting polls, right? So that is not supported in the passage anywhere. So that might be a baggage distractor, or you might be inferring too much. And then finally, here we also have a sort of too extreme distractor that they're inherently unreliable. Yeah, they might not always account for all variables, but that doesn't make them entirely unreliable, okay? So deductively, we should arrive at B. Now, why do I think you maybe didn't choose B? Well, one, I think diverse demographic weighting. You might be thinking about diversity in one particular lens, even though it's in multiple lenses here. And then also it said here that it won't fully resolve the discrepancies, and you might think, well, it doesn't fully resolve it. But here we only say reduce errors, right? We don't say fully resolve, it says reduce errors. So that might help, but they won't fully resolve. So that's how we arrive to B for this question. All right, well, I'm hoping that my smart kids that we always have here at Hamilton found 14 at least a little funny, seeing as that the correct answer choice, ironically, does exactly the opposite of all of these things suggested by linguist Steven Pinker and psychologist Daniel Oppenheimer, right? So Ultimately here, we want to lead to this inference here, right? We want to lead to this conclusion. How do we arrive there? Well, we see that these things bad, and these things are good, and these things are good to do because these things, jargon and technical terms, are bad, right? So let's translate B, eschewing overwrought diction, meaning avoiding overly complex diction, and simplifying sentence structure, which is right here, can enhance reader understanding and increase perception of writer's ethos. That's perfect, right? A is sort of too extreme here, right? Ensure the clarity of any written text, right? That's an absolute there. We want to be on the lookout for that. C, again, we see that as well. All forms of technical language and specialized language. And then finally, D, you might need to do a little translation, right? Conveying ideas in an erudite fashion, meaning clearly, and embracing the positive perceptions engendered by sophisticated vocabulary earns the respect of readers. Okay, so this is good, but sophisticated vocabulary doesn't lead to positive perceptions. It leads to negative perceptions, right? So that's why we can also get rid of D. And that's how we get through 14 and finish up the reading section on this first model. All right, so question 15 is our first writing question on the test, our first kind of grammar question here. So we're asked a little bit about lists and how we create what are called elaborations. So why B is correct is you can use a semicolon to create an elaboration. And when you use that you can use a colon to create an elaboration. You cannot use a semicolon to create an elaboration like this, okay? You can only use a colon. Why? Because with a colon, everything on the left must be an independent clause, meaning it can stand on its own as a sentence. But everything to the right doesn't need to. Okay, so here we're introducing a list with the colon, and we use the colon because everything up until same items is something that would stand alone as a sentence. You can't use A because what comes after cannot stand on its own as an independent clause. Therefore, we will not use a semicolon because semicolons, both sides need to be able to stand on their own as a sentence. C creates a run-on. And D, we cannot use a comma to introduce this kind of like elaboration here, right? We can only use dashes or colons to create an elaboration, which is why we'd use B to create this elaborative list. All right, so question 16 is a very similar question to 15. We have an elaboration. Elaborations mean that what is on the left of the elaboration is a independent clause, meaning it can stand on its own as a sentence. And what comes to the right of it, it depends. Okay, so in this case, it is not something that can stand on its own. Those that represent facial expressions and those that symbolize objects or activities is not even a clause. That's just an explanation. It's just an elaboration. So that's why D is correct. You can't use C because with the semicolon, you need both sides to be able to stand on their own. All right. Finally, B, we are missing parallel structure, and we also have an issue of creating a non-essential phrase that in this case isn't, right? And then A is a run-on. So that's how we arrive to D for question 16. So this question 17 does a really good job of showing us that we don't always need punctuation. It's a punctuation question in a sense, but ultimately it's a way of showing that we don't need it unless it fulfills a role. All right, so let's show how some of this punctuation is wrong. For C, this comma here connecting to this comma here suggests frequently born until high level is a non-essential phrase, meaning we can take it out. But when we read it with it taken out, it says many studies have indicated that athletes even excelling at totally unrelated sports. That doesn't make any sense, right? D does the same thing, and B does the same thing, right? All of these create a non-essential phrase at that comma that doesn't make any sense. However, This is a pretty long clause. So we might just think to ourselves, oh, can I really say many studies have indicated that athletes are frequently born with the above average eye coordination necessary to succeed? Well, yeah, of course you can, because there's one subject, there's one verb, and it's all written in a way where you don't need a non-essential phrase or anything like that. This is just a clause. It's a long clause, but it is one. That's how we arrived at A, understanding we don't need any punctuation. Okay, so 18 is similar to 17 in that there are a lot of places where we could feel like we need punctuation where we actually don't need punctuation. Okay, so what is the one piece of punctuation we actually need in this sentence? We need to separate the two adjectives, brightly lit and bustling, from the noun that they qualify, centers. Okay, so that means we get rid of D, right? Because we're not saying that the bustling is brightly lit, we're saying that the centers are brightly lit. So as such, we would need to put a comma between the two adjectives that explain centers. However, one thing we never want to do is put a comma between an adjective and a noun, right? A doesn't work because we can't put a comma between bustling and centers. Bustling describes the centers. I find this is an error that students make for some reason once you add more than one adjective to describe a noun. Finally, with B and C, remember that we don't always need a comma to connect to a word that also shows up in fanboys, because fanboys are only when we are connecting to independent clauses, right? So what are these bustling centers filled with? They're filled with thing A, or thing one, which is flashing lights, and thing two, characteristics nouns, right? If we're just connecting two things, we use and. In the same way, you might say, Rio and David, or Rio and Brian are my teachers for the SAT. You would say things are filled with flashing lights and electronic sounds. We do not need a comma to separate just two items that are being put together. Okay, so that's how we arrive to B for question 18. All right, so question 19 is a subject verb agreement question. So we would need to find what our basically our noun is and what verb we're using with it. So our noun is communication, one, right? And then our verb is coming here. So communication being singular means that we need to put it in the singular form, meaning communication enables, right? If you chose B, you maybe are thinking books and television shows enable him to connect with audiences, but that's not what enables him. Communication enables him, right? Communication has enabled him would work if he has stopped, or if this was not in the present, right? And then finally, we wouldn't say which has enabled him. And then finally, have is in the wrong number. So wrong tense, wrong number, correct tense and number for A. All right, so for question 20 here, we have a couple of different things at play, right? So we are trying to decide how to show the proper number and the proper addition of an apostrophe to show possession for these here. Okay, so we need to understand that surfers is plural. Okay, so because surfers is plural, we need to make sure that our S comes before our apostrophe. So that gets rid of B as an answer choice. Right. Now, we need to make sure that sports is singular, right? So that means that our apostrophe has to come before our S, which means we can get rid of A and D. As such, our only answer choice that works is C. All right, so question 21 is a really pretty straightforward non-essential phrase question. Okay, so we have a non-essential phrase begun with a comma here, meaning we need to end our non-essential phrase with a comma, which is what we see in A, B, C, and D. Now we also need to understand that we have a compound thing here, right? So they're doing two things. He's emphasizing distance and precision in downfield throws, right? So these both describe downfield throws here. And because this and is taking the place of what could be a comma, right? You could have said emphasizing distance, precision in downfield throws, right? We don't want to use a comma between the and, because that would suggest that he's emphasizing distance and then another element, which is precision in downfield throws. All right, so we cannot have a comma between the two, right, which gets rid of B and D. Then finally, why can we get rid of C? Well, C suggests that we need a comma here, which we clearly don't, because that separates our modifier from what it's modifying. So that is how we arrive to A. Okay, so question 2 is a transitions question. That means I want us thinking about what category of transition we need in the place here, rather than just taking these answer choices and plugging them in. So we need a cause and effect transition. Why? Because the logic of this says point A is the cause. We have longer, more productive lives due to all of this innovation. Therefore, or as such, right, as a consequence of, the effect is that therefore we expect to work far beyond traditional retirement age. Okay, so what shows that? Consequently. Consequently is our only answer choice, which is of that cause and effect. However, nonetheless, are both kind of pivoting words, though nevertheless is a little bit more of a concession, and otherwise doesn't fit cause and effect either. So that is how we can arrive to consequently, thinking in terms of our categories of transitions. 23 here on module 1 is another transitions question. With transitions questions, I always want us thinking, what category of transition can I put in this place here, rather than just taking answer choices and plugging them in. All right. So what we want here is an additional information passive transition category. Why? Because we are getting a string of arguments listed in a row, and they all build on one another, right? So we have this argument, then this argument, and this argument, and then finally this one here, right? So which one is an additional information category here? Furthermore, right? Meaning you are adding more to it, furthermore. Henceforth has something to do with time, which additional information kind of does as well, but this means from this point forward. Okay, so we're not saying from this point forward, an open office is more likely to spark impromptu casual conversations. It's just another thing. On the other hand, which sounds really good, it's actually a concession. Okay. On the other hand, would have to pivot away from what began. Okay. It's not an additional information, it's a contrasting information. And although shows up at the beginning of dependent clauses typically, and it also is a pivoting transition, contrasting information transition. So the only answer choice which fits our additional information transition is furthermore. Okay, to figure that out, you're going to just have to read the passage and figure out its logic. Once you figure out that category, you can find the correct one. All right, so question 24 is a transitions question here on module 1. And always with transitions questions, I want us thinking about what kind of category of transition do we want in this blank space, rather than just taking our answer choices and plugging them in. So the category we want here is additional information. Why is it clear that we want additional information? Well, we're listing a claim, or we have a claim up here, right? And then we are supporting this claim with evidence, right? And this is another piece of evidence led in support of that claim. So additional information is usually in support of a claim or an idea, and we're supporting it using our additional information word of moreover, meaning additionally. Therefore is a cause and effect, and notice that therefore and consequently are both here, both in the exact same format. How could we use either of these cause and effects together, right? How could you decide that therefore is better than consequently? You can't, okay? And then however is a contrasting information category one, meaning we would be refuting something that came before or giving new information, like whereas up here, but that is not what we're doing in this case. We're just adding additional information to a claim to support it, so we'll use moreover. All right, so for question 25, we have a rhetorical synthesis question, which means we really want to focus on what we say in the question. This is the most important words you'll read on these type of questions, all right? So the influence of the Russian Five on diplomatic relations during the Cold War. And so many of our answer choices are true of the passage, but they don't talk about diplomacy. So notice A does connect, right, to down here, but does it mention diplomacy? No, right? B, it talks about the Cold War and being a poignant symbol, but does it talk about diplomacy? No, right? This is something of a recycled language distractor, both of these, especially this one using Cold War like we want in the question. And then C, even though it connects to something in our text, right? Does it talk about diplomacy? No. Right, so that's what leads us to D, in that we do get all these other things from here, but most important, we see this right here, which directly connects to here, right? So always make sure we're just looking at where we need to look on these. And yeah, with that, we can move on. Question 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question, meaning we want to definitely focus on the question itself. All right, this is the most important words we'll read on this question is up here, right? Not here, not on their answer choices, right there. So compare habitation tendencies, right? Meaning we need to look at where they live, all right? Let's look at a few of these. So A, oh look, we have where they live and what they do, okay? However, if you chose A, you fell for one of the trickiest distractors I've seen on the SAT, which is they'll have a statement which doesn't actually accurately use information from the notes. Do nomads live in settled villages more often than pastoralists? No, that's the opposite, right? It's pastoralists who are more likely to live settled lifestyles. Okay, B is correct. We know this, right? Here, we see a little bit of a different habitation, right? We see truly mobile lifestyle and portable shelters, which we see right here. And then pastoralists with a more sedentary lifestyle right here. Now, sedentary is a word that you'll need to know to get this question right. Another example of why learning vocab is helpful. Here we definitely compare them like we want, but is there any habitation? No. Okay. And then D, we talk only about pastoralists. So do we talk about habitation? Yes, but only for pastoralists. So we're missing one of our parameters. That's why all of them that are not B are wrong and B is correct. All right, so 27 is a rhetorical synthesis question. That means we need to look at the question itself. So we want to focus on the impact it had while also discussing the method by which they were produced. All right, so C, we see the method right here, and we see the impact right here. So that is why C is correct. You have impact and you have method. Okay. B, we have just the method. Okay. With just the method, we are not getting the history, the impact, get rid of it. Okay. A, we have historical documentation, which isn't exactly the history of photography, right? And then we also have, ultimately, it just doesn't actually describe or explore the impact on photography, right? But not to the same way C does. C does it much better. And then finally, D shows the impact, but does it talk about the way it works? Not at all. So that's why D is no good. That's how we can arrive to C, by finding something wrong in all the rest of them and seeing that C is just better. With that, we come to the end of Module 1. Okay, moving on to the second module here. This test, we're looking at our first question, a word and context question. This is a classic one where if you know the vocab, it's really pretty easy. In fact, very easy. However, if you don't know the vocab, this is going to be pretty difficult. It meaning if you miss this question, it is likely that you just need to spend a little bit more time studying vocab, right? If you're seeing this early on in tutoring or teaching, you'll grow better with time, but we have a lot of words spread across Quizlet and other places for you to study this. So here we're looking for a definition or clue in the text. Where's our clue? That there's excessive decoration and focus on superficial beauty rather than substance and seriousness in the art, right? So Rococo then would not be minimalist, right? Because minimalist would mean minimal. Nor would it be austere, which is basically like Spartan or lacking in something. So when something is austere, it means it's minimal, right? The desert is always people always talk about how the desert has an austere beauty, meaning there's not much there, but it's pretty. Now, ostensible kind of sounds like ostentatious, but ultimately it means kind of like supposedly or like purportedly, but not actually, right? So we're not really. So, um, you might say something along the lines of like, he was ostensibly an expert in economics, but on the debate stage, repeated lots of lies, right? So, um, that doesn't fit here at all. So ostentatious is the only one that doesn't not work, meaning it's the one that works. What does ostentatious mean? It means it's an overly showy, sort of kind of like almost cringe-worthy display of prettiness, right? So think about like a shirt that says Gucci, 500,000 times on it, right? That's an ostentatious display. Usually has something to do with wealth or something like that. So ostentatious being excessive decoration and superficial beauty, it's perfect. If you're missing this, you probably just don't know what two of these words mean, meaning you're going to do a 50-50 guess. Better to know what all of them mean. So study that vocab. All right, so question 2 here is another word and context question. So I would really say if you're missing this question, you're likely not reading as much of this passage as you can, or as you should, right? So many of these will fit into this sentence, right? You can demonstrate remarkable integrity in diplomacy and manipulation of strategy. You can display a lot of force in diplomacy and strategic manipulation. You can even display prudence in diplomacy and strategic manipulation. But you can also display or demonstrate acumen or having an acumen in diplomacy and strategic manipulation. Okay, so all of these work up till here. It's the rest that's going to clarify this, right? So we're seeing skillfully navigate things, gauge the intentions of others. We see shrewdness, right? All of these words line up with acumen. Okay. Acumen has something to do with, or basically is meaning it's not exactly an innate skill, but pretty much is. Okay. So it's a skill that you've developed early on. You're just kind of better at it than other people. And it typically has something to do with judgment, or like maybe being quick in your judgment or your decision making process and skillful in it, right? So acumen works there. Prudence is a similar-ish word, but typically prudence has a connotation of kind of cautiousness, right? It is about being sensible and rational, right? Particularly in kind of like a very practical sort of way. So it is prudent to get a 401k, right? It doesn't require acumen to get a 401k, though it is prudent to do that. Integrity, I mean, he's talking about manipulating. I don't know if manipulation is integrity, really. And then finally, force, we see that there's skillful navigation, engaging intentions, right? doesn't seem like he's pushing something through forcefully. So acumen is the best word here. If you missed this, it's probably that you chose prudence, not knowing that acumen is a similar but much more precise word for this question. All right, so for question 3, I think one of the best ways you can arrive to the correct answer of periphery is by reading the whole question, finding the word that you're looking, or like the definition that you're looking for, and then using that to get rid of the other answer choices that you might actually know what they mean, right? Periphery, we should know, means on the outside of something, right? You have peripheral vision, meaning you can see things at the edge of your vision. So we have the opposite of core being periphery. So that's a reason why we want periphery. And we also see limited access to resources and technological advancements. And at a disadvantage, when you're on the periphery, it means you're also on the outside, right? So you're outside of these things. Now, if you can't just arrive to that through knowing what core and periphery are opposites of each other, you might be able to get rid of some of these other ones. So zenith and hegemon mean something kind of similar. When something is at a zenith, it means it is at the ultimate top, right? You might say that like LeBron James was at the zenith of his powers when he was his second stint as a Cleveland Cavalier, meaning that was when he was kind of in his prime. A hegemon is also meaning to be at the top, but particularly in a power or hierarchical situation. So the hegemon is the core here. So if you're selecting hegemon and you know what it means, it's probably because you're falling for an opposite distractor. Finally, a nexus is a network. And while we're describing a network up here, only it doesn't relate to what we're doing right here, which is finding basically the opposite of this word core. So that's how we arrive to periphery for question 3. Always remember, you can find out what words mean by thinking, periphery, is that related to peripheral vision? And you can probably figure out what that word means via that 90-10 attempt. So for question 4, I want to point to this right here. Precise, all right, and logical. Okay, so this is what we're always asked on the test. That means we cannot use something which is doesn't fit the norms of English. Okay, it means we have to use the word that most exactly means what we want to say, not something that's just simply close. All right. So what are we saying here? We are saying that these things, these steps that used to be essential, they used to be essential, are now no longer essential, right? We are looking for the opposite of essential, okay? That helps us get rid of answer choice A, indispensable. Indispensable means it is essential, right? If something is indispensable, it means that we can't dispense with it. We can't get rid of it. Intricate is kind of a misleading thing here, right? These are intricate steps. But are these intricate steps intricate to the process of producing good photography? No, right? Wouldn't make sense really to say that something is intricate to something, nor are these intricate steps intricate to the process of producing new things. They are unessential, non-essential. Now, we have outdated versus the correct answer, superfluous, okay? So, to some degree, yeah, sure, many of these things are now outdated, right? But are they outdated to the process of producing compelling photography? Not really, not at all, right? They are outdated in general. Okay, we want to say that these are extra steps, right? We want to say that these are unessential extra steps that we don't need to follow to produce compelling images, right? Not that they are outdated, meaning they don't work anymore, right? They certainly could work, but they're just extra steps that we don't need to follow. Superfluous means exactly that, right? If something is superfluous, it is something that it's extra stuff that we just don't need, right? Unnecessary, that is just there, that's more than we need to do. Okay, so D is the most precise word and is the most logical there. We also would not typically use outdated in that sort of prepositional sense. We wouldn't say outdated to the process, right? We might say that the process is outdated, but we might not say that these things are outdated to, these steps are outdated to the process, right? But we would say that they're superfluous. So it's logical for that reason. It's more logical for that reason, and it's more precise for that reason, which is why we'll go with D. So for question 5, I want to reiterate what our approach is to word and context questions. We want to find what kind of word we would put here, and then look and find that by looking for synonyms or definitions in the passage. Okay. What is the logic here? We're saying that financial incentives, legal procedures, and stuff may help families resettle in their home countries. We even see almost a direct synonym, repat Armenia, right? A desire to reverse brain drain and cause professionals to return and contribute to their native economies, right? Repatriation, if you think a little bit about Latin here, means to go back to your fatherland, right? Go back to the place where you're from. The patri here relating to ultimately father, and then to, kind of country. If you're a patriot, you support your homeland. And then re meaning to go back. C is an opposite distractor that you might like more because it's a word you're more familiar with, expat, okay? But an expat leaves somewhere. Emigration, okay, well, emigration is the leaving of a place, right? Immigration is going to somewhere. Emigration is leaving somewhere. So immigration, would be kind of hard to get rid of, but emigration you can get rid of. And finally, naturalization is when you get used to living in a place, you naturalize there, you've been there for long enough that now you speak the language, you follow the kind of cultural procedures. Doesn't fit like repatriation does, which means basically just to return to your homeland. All right, for number 6, we are looking to use the rest of this passage to give us the logical word here. All right, so what are we looking for? We are looking for the opposite of a profound synthesis. We're looking for something that shows that abstract reasoning, or relates abstract reasoning and subjective interpretation with formal logic and objective precision, and the opposite of a profound synthesis. What is that? What would we want to say to clarify that, or to kind of signify that? Well, we would want to say something along the lines of that they are incompatible. We don't have the answer choice incompatible, but we have a very close synonym, irreconcilable. All right, when something is irreconcilable, it means we cannot bring them together. Now, interchangeable, definitely not the case here, right? Interchangeable is kind of an opposite distractor with this. And harmonious is what's described here, but not up here, right? We want the opposite of harmonious. However, combative goes too far, right? Is there anything that's, so even though combative is kind of the opposite of harmonious, and even though combative is certainly not a synthesis, is there anything in here which suggests that these things are at war with each other? They're fighting? No. All right. So I'm assuming if you miss this question, you're likely choosing an answer like B, combative, which is nearly there, but irreconcilable is simply a more precise version of combative that better fits this context more logically. So that's why we go with C for this question. And that brings us to the end of the word out context questions for our second module. All right, so question 7 is our cross-text connections question on the second module. Usually we'll see about 1 or 2 of these per test. They're usually with some of our trickier questions. So just to briefly summarize these 2 passages, both of which you have read, we see that text 1 says that genomic editing is a powerful technology that we should consider using, except they don't want to do it in the germ line, right? They don't want to do it in human embryos because of the impacts it could have. Text 2 talks about the moral concerns or the moral implications of biotechnology, but in the positive sense, right? It is saying that we should use biotechnology to improve human flourishing, right? So it is an ethical argument about the ethical implications or moral implications of genomic editing, but in the positive, not the negative. So if you misread either of these texts, especially text 2, that's going to make this very hard, right? If you saw text 2 as saying, there's too many moral implications for CRISPR, you're probably going to go with either A, B, or something like that, right? However, once we really see it, right now, also you might think, they are saying in text 1 that we shouldn't do it, right? However, it's only in human embryos, right? They think that they should do it elsewhere, but not human embryos. So here we have a extreme distractor. We already talked about A, B, and A and B. So D, yes, they say that they both offer, right, the opportunity to treat human life, and they should be considered, but only within certain contexts, right? Down here, it's all context pretty much, but up here, making sure that it's not with embryos. That's what leads us to D, our correct answer. All right, so question 8 uses a beautiful poem by a wonderful poet to ask about the main purpose of the text. All right, so just the text in general, right here. So how do we see this here? Okay, so what does it do? Okay, this portion right here. It does it. So this is what I would call a half right and Finding Nemo distractor. Okay, that's a fish right there. You can tell because of the eye. So symbolizing the cruel inequality within rural communities, where on earth would you get that from? Right? Is it an arresting image? Yes. But is it that? No. So it produces a powerful metaphor which speaks to the harsh cruelty of nature and the consequences of scarcity. I would say that that is maybe perhaps true, but I don't think that it is our best answer when we see that C clarifies that main purpose even better, right? We have the central irony of the poem, right? This cruel luxuriance is a central irony because though the deer could not survive the cold winter, it nonetheless is able to bear witness to the springtime abundance. Perfect. All right. D talks about a central irony, which is great, but how would we support this, right? How is this true, right? That is leading to too much of kind of guessing, whereas C is irrefutable. So that's how we arrive at C for this great question number 8. All right, so question 9, we have a main idea of the text overall, right? So we want to make sure that we read the whole text in order to come to our conclusion. Okay, so we read the whole text. I've assumed you've read it. If you haven't, go ahead and pause and read it. We will see that there are a lot of examples of what it used to be. This is what the old view was. But now we have a new view that challenges the long-held idea. So even though the majority of the passage is talking about one thing, you'll see that the main idea is actually here, which is that societal collapse may have actually been at most a small reduction. All right, so A shows that, right? All of the information in here leads to A. If you didn't select A, I'm assuming that you either fixated too much up here and didn't read the whole passage, or you used a baggage distractor, right? So this aligns with the old view, but the main idea is in this second new view. C, this is a recycled language distractor. That is true. right? That is right here. But this is only half right because this portion is incorrect, right? That small population has always been a small population. This is not supported here. And then finally, D, even if it is a recycled language, does that connote the main idea here? No, the main idea is all this in there. So that's how we arrive to A for question 9. All right, so we want to support the researcher's claims. So what is the researcher's claims? So that dry farming is more sustainable and that dry farming can be particularly competitive in ecoregions conducive for dry farming, right? Though dry farming might not be feasible in locations less suitable. So even though the productivity of conventional exceeds, benefits go to dry farming because it has lower input costs and a higher consumer price point due to the increased flavor profile and prestige. Right, so what would show their claim that we have dry farming being competitive with conventional farming so long as it is in the right ecoregion rather than the wrong one? All right, so D says that conventional farming is more productive in both locations, which is stated right here. Dry farming in the coastal valley was significantly more productive than dry farming in the central valley, suggesting dry farmers' suitability in locations with higher rainfall and soils with higher water retention, which is exactly what was stated right here. Okay, and now we see that that is true, right? There's high water retention, lower temperatures. Dry farming is very productive. Okay, so that's how we get to D. Now let's look at some of these distractors, right? Failing to eclipse the productivity of conventional farming is not part of the researchers' claims, right? That is not supporting their claims about the dry farming, all right? This is talking solely about conventional farming, right? We can't talk only about conventional farming if we are talking about their claims about dry farming. And then for A, was this actually in the table? I don't believe so. As such, unsupported, and we have to go with D. All right, so for question 11, we want to weaken Reynolds' claim. All right, so what is Reynolds' claim? He claims that there is an outcome of a cultural shift, right? Which is that individuals find commercial imagery from past eras because it no longer serves a commercial purpose, right? He also suggests that it is a middle-class trope reflecting socioeconomic position and cultural prestige, right? So if we can refute this or refute this, we're good. D refutes the socioeconomic claim up here, right? So if we're doing that, we have that refutation, it's good. Unless there's an answer choice which refutes both. However, this talks about youth. Do we talk about socioeconomic position? No. Do we talk about commercial purposes losing them? No. Right? This supports this claim, right? But we want to weaken the claim, which is why we can get rid of B. And then A is just a simple fact that just would state that vintage has gone up. But we are talking specifically about actually nostalgia linked to class and cultural privilege. So we are only focused right here. And as such, these answer choices do nothing to talk of that. But D refutes it specifically because B doesn't weaken the claim, it supports it. So that's how we arrived at D. And if you missed any of those steps, that's how you would arrive to the incorrect answer choice. All right, so question 12 is an inference question, and I really think it's a tour de the way you can get this wrong is because there's a tour de force of distractors here. All right, so 1.2% of Earth's land, that is recycling language, but unnecessary for the conservation. Unnecessary is a too extreme distractor, right? So watch out for those two extreme distractors. Um, so greater collaboration between governments and ecologists will be required. That's really good. We do need to see that, right? According to this passage, which I'm understanding that you have read and understood. Pause and reread it if you haven't. However, to effectively intervene in places where poaching and habitat destruction are rampant, that's kind of a half right? That's not exactly what we're saying here. What we're saying is that we need to protect these sites from a bunch of different things. This is too specific to focus. Finally, D is a opposite or too extreme distractor, in that conservation efforts, targeted ones, according to this passage, are actually really helpful. Okay, so B expands on this claim because right here, we are saying that these important sites are only being protected 7% of the time. So to succeed in better conservation efforts, the governments must base guidance from experts in these fields, showing you where these critical conservation imperative sites are. So B is all good, but the best way to arrive at B is seeing that there's something clearly wrong in A, C, and D. All right, so question 13 here is a nice little question about Matt Waldron, a pitcher for the San Diego Padres, at least in the 2024 season. He had a good run there. So the passage talks about how he is unique because he's a knuckleballer, meaning he throws the ball in a certain way that is not common due to particular strategies of front offices. Right, I really want to point out distractors in our answer choices. Okay. Eliminated charming idiosyncrasies of the game. Right. While it has reduced them, the very existence of Matt Waldron points to the fact that they are not eliminated. Permanent comeback is a dominant pitch in baseball. It's dominant for him, Matt Waldron, but he's the only one that does it according to this passage, right? Which is why we can get rid of B. And then finally, with D, this part makes sense, right? But while most pitchers are capable of throwing with high velocity, that is a too extreme of an inference, right? So there are distractors that make A, B, and D wrong. Now C supports the passage idea as a whole, right? Knuckleballing has been marginalized because of the focus on spin rate and velocity, but it being marginalized was maybe a mistake because it does still seem to be effective in professional baseball. So that's how we get to C. That's why C is correct. But most importantly, we've seen why A, B, and D are incorrect, which is probably the most sensible way to arrive to C. All right, so the most important sentence in 14 for this inference question is right here. What exactly is an economic luxury and an economic necessity? So necessities are those that we will always buy, whether we are in a recession or not. When the economy is strong, we spend a lot of money on necessities. When the economy is weak, we spend the same amount of money on necessities, or we actually spend more money on necessities. And in a weak economy, we cut back on goods we see as luxuries. Now, what's ironic here is that in the current state of this passage here, we suggest that steak is a increase, right? We're getting more increasing buying at steakhouses, suggesting that dining out at steakhouses are an economic necessity. which means we spend on those in times where the economy isn't strong. We don't cut them out entirely as a luxury, right? Because we're engaging in substitution, right? Because we are seeing a steady or even increased patronage despite the economic downturn. That means this is going up during the downturn, which suggests that steak, ironically, is a necessity. So that suggests that therefore some consumers see dining out at steak restaurants as a necessity, that they seek ways to mitigate the cost. All right. Good. Okay. So we're talking about an economic necessity, which is jargon defined in this passage. All right. Here we see impervious to these impacts and premium dining experiences. That is refuted in the passage, right? Because premium dining experiences right there do kind of go down a little bit. Also, this is too inspecific in general. So B is sort of like a baggage distractor. Sure, that might be true, but is that what's supported directly by where this passage is going? No, right? We're talking specifically about steak restaurants and the economic theory of substitution and luxuries and necessities. And finally, are they ignoring this principle entirely? No, right? Because they are seeking out somewhat cheaper alternatives by going to places like Texas Roadhouse and Longhorn Steakhouse as opposed to a delicious place like Pinnacle Peak. So as such, that's how we can arrive to D and actually finish up our reading section for both of these modules of test 306. All right, so question 15 here on module 2, we have a pretty simple punctuation question with a little bit of verb tense there as well. So first things first, we want to make sure we have a proper creation of a non-essential phrase, and all of these do that. Secondly, we want to make sure that we do not have a colon to begin our list. Why can we not have a colon beginning our list? Well, our list doesn't come after a independent clause, right? Diners unfamiliar with this concept can expect the chef to prepare a menu which includes cannot stand on its own, right? So we can only use a colon to begin a list if what's after the colon, or what's before the colon, excuse me, is an independent clause that's able to stand on its own. So that's why we can get rid of B and C. Now, finally, we have include or includes as our verb tense because the non-essential phrases are correct. The lack of colons are correct. And we know that we want it to be includes because of this which, right? A menu which includes. So that it is correct in number for includes. Non-essential phrase is correct. And we don't want the colon because what comes before the colon needs to stand on its own as an independent clause. So that is how we arrive to D. Question 16 is a pretty straightforward non-essential phrase question here. So seeing as that we have a non-essential phrase, we don't want to use that, right? That is typically essential. That is can sometimes be a non-essential phrase, but usually is used as a kind of concession or qualification, right? So this is not qualifying what comes before in the sense that that is would be used. Rather, it's just explaining it. So we want to use which, non-essential phrase, right? Want to use which to begin the non-essential phrase. So it's our difference between B and D. Well, B has this comma between ancient and agricultural, but it isn't an ancient technique and an agricultural technique. It is an ancient agricultural technique, right? The subject or the noun is agricultural technique. Okay, and ancient is the adjective there. Agricultural is not an adjective in this case, which leads us to seeing that D is our only correct answer that we could use for 16. Okay, so 17 is a number question for tense. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're using the right number and tense for our conjugation. And we want to make sure that we are checking what we use to create that conjugation in tense. So we want to look up here. It says each of these adaptations. Okay. Each shows that we are in the singular. If you're missing questions like this, I might suggest that you underline what you're actually looking at. Why do we know it needs to be each? Well, this everything from which to habitats is ultimately a non-essential phrase. So each reflects, right? So each reflects. It's because we're singular. We use the singular conjugation in terms of number. All right, reflect is plural. Have reflected would just not be the right tense here, right? We're just sticking in the simple present. And reflected is the simple past, also doesn't work as the tense for this, right? So we want it to be in the singular present. A does that for us perfectly. All right, 18 here is a question that I'm assuming a lot of you missed because we do not know a certain little fact, a certain thing that we need to know when it comes to conjugation and grammar. So the team is singular, right? In the same way that the family or the company is singular. Though those singular nouns are composed of multiple constituent singular nouns, meaning like there's multiple people on a team, there's multiple people in a family, etc. The noun itself, the team, is only singular. It's only one team. Why? Because like I just said, there's only one team. If there's only one team showing off its trophy to the countless fans, we need to use the singular of its, right? Now, we don't want to use its with the apostrophe because its apostrophe S, we imagine that little apostrophe is a little I. It is. The team showed off it is trophy. No, we just want to possessive. Ones doesn't work here. That doesn't make any sense. If you miss this question, it is very likely you chose there because you're thinking, the team is more than one because there's more than one person on the team. Therefore, we would be plural. But no, there is only one team. Doesn't matter how many people are in that team. The team could be 400 million, right? In the same way that the USA is singular, right? Um, the collective noun is a singular noun unless it is otherwise stated in the text. So here, the team is a singular noun, which is why we go with our singular conjugation of its. Okay, so question 19 is very classic of this new SAT. All right, we're talking about the gaucho and some things they do, including drinking yerba mate out of a hollowed out gourd. Here we are. Look, I'm almost a gaucho right now, huh? Anyways, okay, so what's being asked about here, what's being evaluated here is your ability to produce lists with semicolons. So when do we use semicolons in a list? In a very particular circumstance. We do it when items in the list require commas in the list. Okay, so here we're using commas, right, to introduce our explanations in the list. All right, so we need commas. If we did, okay, but those aren't sure are empanadas, right? Sausages and mate. So the way in which we clarify that is by having semicolons separate the items in our list. Okay, so I'm going to erase all this just to show you, I'm just going to show you what's wrong with a few of these and what's right with our correct one. Okay, so here, this semicolon here makes A wrong. Why? It suggests that empanadas and savory filled pastries are two separate items, right? So we need to clarify that that needs to be a comma, all right? Because this is clarifying what an empanada is. Okay. B, we are suggesting that we have a non-essential phrase from savory pastries to gourd, but that all is essential, right? To the list as we have it. All right. C, we know is wrong because these commas are what separate our items. And we also have this colon up here that is unnecessary. So why is D correct? Well, it does the proper thing of using a semicolon to separate our items in our list and commas to introduce the explanations for the items of that list, right? So D does everything right. A, B, and C don't do everything right. They make mistakes. That is how we can arrive to D for this long, kind of confusing, but ultimately fair question of 19. All right, so question 20, we have a few things that we need to consider, all right? We're looking at influences versus influence, and we're looking at ecosystems versus ecosystems, okay? So ecosystems where the apostrophe comes after the S, or ecosystems where the apostrophe comes before the S, and whether we want influence singular or influence plural, all right? So why do we want influence singular? Why can we get rid of A and B? Well, because we see was significant, right? So the was there is referring to influence, right? How can we tell? Because this sentence could say many anthropologists now believe that while the influence was significant, all right? So that was a singular. That means we can get rid of influences plural. Now we're between whether ecosystems is singular and plural, right? Well, we can see that ecosystems up here is plural, right? We're talking about more than one ecosystem. We're talking about the similar ecosystems from the Ainu and Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. So because ecosystems must also be plural, or well, ecosystems must be plural, that means we can get rid of D, which says that ecosystem is singular, right? These also clarifies that ecosystems must be plural. With that, we arrive to C. All right, 21 does something that the SAT loves to do, which is throw a very, very long non-essential phrase in between our subject and our verb. All right, so how many teams are there? One. As such, our verb here needs to be conjugated to the singular. What are our singular options? Well, B, right? We also, though, so were is plural, past tense. Have is plural in this progressive tense. Now, we also have a singular option, publishes, in the simple present. But why do we know it's not the simple present? Well, the team has published this groundbreaking paper, right? Because it is not something that is currently happening presently. It is something that did take place, right? So it has been published, and it does these things currently. It's highlighting these things currently, but the publishing was something that took place at one point, right? It's not a continual publishment. It is published once, it's over. That's how we can tell that we want it to be singular and in this tense. So that's how we go with B for 21. All right, so question 22 here is constructed or getting at basically the same exact thing that question 19 gets at, which is how do we create lists with semicolons? All right. So we want to make sure that each item in the list is separated by a semicolon, right? And we want to do that because there are items in the list which require commas, right? So seeing as that there must be a comma within one of these items in the list, we have to use semicolons to separate the items in the list. Otherwise, we would think that in-depth and viable policy recommendations are two different elements of this list here, when they are in fact part of the same element, right? And we need a comma between the two because in-depth doesn't describe what viable is, right? So A, you need the comma between in-depth and viable. With B, well, look, we do this all correct, but what do we know about that last item on the list? We use an and to put our last item in the list. And we're missing an and here for B. Okay. Then finally, C, we have a comma here, which suggests that we have another item in the list, and patriotism, which is actually connected to this item in the list, the appeal to strong values, or strong appeals to American values and patriotism, right? So there's something wrong with each of these answer choices that we do not select, right? Hunt for what makes answer choices wrong rather than what makes answer choices right, and you will arrive at the right answer. Then evaluate your correct answer and see, okay, everything's good here, right? We need the comma between these two. We need the semicolons between the items in the list. We don't want a comma there. Perfect. Does everything right. We need a comma at the end. Yeah, so good. That's how we arrive to D. All right, so 23, we have a transitions question. I always want us thinking about what category of transition goes here, rather than thinking, what word do I want to take from our answer choice and plug in, right? First things first, I'm going to point out that therefore and consequently, both are cause and effect transitions, and both use the same structure to produce the cause and effect, meaning, how could you choose between the two, right? The category that we want here is a concession, right? We want to contrast information in a way that can moves us to a new perspective, right? It's a contrasting information category. So this shows how his medals were stripped due to the Olympics, right? Which was insane back then. But now he nevertheless, is still seen as a legend. So him having those Olympic medals stripped of him doesn't change things, right? They're stripped likely due to the fact that he was a Native American. They didn't like that. So then similarly would mean that this statement naturally comes from this statement, but that's the opposite, right? So that is how we get to, nevertheless, our pivoting, contrasting information category for transition. All right, so 24 kind of combines punctuation and transitions here. Okay, so we have two answer choices which use semicolons and two answer choices which use a pair of commas. So for transitions, we can use a semicolon if what comes before the transition is an independent clause, and what comes after the transition is an independent clause. Unfortunately, that's not what we have here, right? Christensen, right, is not an independent clause on its own. Okay, so that is how we can get rid of however and therefore. Even though however and though are this same category of transition, they are created differently here due to the punctuation. All right. So now we're between likewise and though, because the punctuation eliminates B and D, even if B is using the right type of transition. So though is a good contrasting information category for transitions. And we put it within the pair of commas because it is embedded within the clause. When we have transitions embedded in a clause, we use a pair of commas. Likewise is the wrong category here because it would suggest that in the same way that his factory burned to the ground, he was undeterred, right? That doesn't make sense, right? We want to pivot and say, even though his factory burned to the ground, he was undeterred. So that's how we get to C for question 24. All right, so for 25, a transitions question, I always want us thinking about a category, right? What category of transition can I implement here rather than what word sounds good of our answer choices? So nonetheless, and yet are both contrasting information categories. They both would do the exact same thing there, and they're both constructed the exact same way with that comma, meaning there's no difference between nonetheless and yet. Therefore, how could we decide between the two? Well, we can't. Also, they don't fit because we don't want a contrasting information here, right? We want cause and effect. Basically, you might think works as cause and effect, but it is not. Basically is an emphasis transition, right? Usually what comes after basically is an explanation or an example of something in the same way we would use indeed or another emphasis transition like that. What we want is a cause and effect, and therefore is the epitome of the cause and effect. How do we know? Well, this is all the cause up here, and the effect is that IT professionals will still be in demand. So that's how we get to D for question 25. All right, so for 26, we have a rhetorical synthesis question. That means the most important thing we're reading here is the question itself. All right, so when we look at the question, we see that we want to emphasize not just the blues, folk, and country influences, right? We want to include what's beyond that. So what is the beyond, quote unquote, for this? Well, right here, okay? This is the blues, folk, and country, but this are composers, including experimentalists and Baroque era, okay? So we need to have an answer choice that talks about those influences, the influences that he had, John Fahey, who you should listen to, by the way, that go beyond the typically seen ones. So answer choice D is the only one which talks about those influences. It's the only answer choice which talks about modern composers and canonical composers, right? So now here we have a little bit of a mistake. Okay, this Leo Kottke is someone that he influenced, not someone who influenced John Fahey, right? So that puts the cart before the horse, to use an idiomatic phrase, right? This person is not an influence on Fahey, but an influence by Fahey. All right. A does the opposite, right? It talks about the influences, particularly from this lexicon. And then finally, C talks about his significance beyond his influences, but we're not talking about his influences beyond those that we're looking for, right? It doesn't have the right parameter. So B is a difficult distractor to get rid of, but once you see why D is better than B, I think it's pretty clear for 26. Question 27 is a rhetorical synthesis question, meaning that the most important thing you're going to read here is the question itself. So we want to discuss the impacts of human intervention on the development of cucurbits. So notice that we're not talking about impacts in a negative or positive or any sort of sense like that, right? We're just saying impacts simply, right? So we want to say what we found here, right? So they were cultivated, and the cultivation has led to the development of a diverse array of shapes, sizes, and flavors. All right, so this note here perfectly aligns with answer choice C, right? We know it began over, as long as 3,000 years ago, and it leads to what we have now. It talks about the domestication, but does it talk about the impact on cucurbits themselves? No. B is the same, right? It just talks about wild cucurbits, but doesn't talk about them being developed. Now, finally, D looks kind of good, except we're seeing that the large and sweet cucurbits being talked about are wild. They're only akin or similar to those developed by human intervention, right? This is the only answer choice which uses this word human intervention, which might lead you to think, this must be correct. However, this isn't even talking about the intervention of humans on wild cucurbits whatsoever, really. It's only talking about wild cucurbits that existed prior to human intervention and some that might coincidentally look like those we eat today. So with that, we arrive to C, and with that, we finish our test. Good job, and hopefully this was helpful.